Our last topic of the War of 1812, we need to talk about a battle and the conclusions. So, we've spoken a lot about DC and the British attacked DC, why they did that, burning of the White House and the Capitol. Following that, the British head off to Baltimore. Baltimore's, I don't know, 40, 50 miles away from Washington, DC. So, they go off there to attack a place called Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry, I'll show you a picture of it. It's not that big of a fort, but it was an important American fort. So we're talking about this story not because of Fort McHenry, but because of another story that came out of it. So that night, when the British were attacking Fort McHenry, there was an American guy. His name was Francis Scott Key, and he watched across the harbor as the British were attacking the fort, and he writes a poem about it. And it was a poem about the battle, which seems kind of random, but anyway. And I asked the class this, is anyone familiar with this poem? And very few people are, but in reality, all of you are familiar with it because it's the Star Spangled Banner, which was the poem. The original name of the poem that he wrote was called The Defense of Fort McHenry. And he was watching this. This is not accurate. He was on a British ship, but he was not a prisoner. He was on a British ship because he was trying to negotiate the release of some American prisoners. Anyway, the easiest way I can kind of explain it is this painting. So in this painting, this is when they attacked Fort McHenry, and Fort McHenry is where my cursor is in the middle, and you see the American flag in the buildings. And the way the British attacked it, Fort McHenry is kind of surrounded by water, and the British had all these warships out in the middle of the harbor, and overnight one night they just bombed it with cannons. And their thinking was, we're going to keep bombing this fort until eventually the Americans either die or surrender. So Francis Scott Key is out here observing, and if you think of some of the lines from the Star Spangled Banner, the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, what he's doing is he's describing the attack, the cannons. And one thing that he couldn't see because it was nighttime, he couldn't see the fort really all that well. So all throughout the night, the British are attacking it, and he doesn't know if the Americans have surrendered. And again, another two lines in the Star Spangled Banner, he talks about dawn's early light, meaning when the sun came up, he could finally see the fort and he could see that the flag was still there, a line from the Star Spangled Banner. So, anyway, what this poem became was our Star Spangled Banner, and it was about Fort McHenry. Anyway, here's a picture of the fort, a few buildings, flag. This is the water out here. This is where the ships would have been, and this is how they bombed them. Okay, let's wrap this up. Shortly thereafter, the British call up the Americans and say, you know what, we're sick of fighting. We want this war to be over with. It's pointless. It's dumb, whatever. So the Americans agreed to sit down and meet with them. And they meet at a place called Ghent, which is a weird name, but that's a city in Belgium. Anyhow, they sit down with the British, and a little bit different. No one really won this war. No one really lost this war. They just kind of agreed to stop fighting. Nothing really changed. The Americans didn't get any land, the British didn't get any land. It kind of went back to the way it was before. So there really wasn't a winner or a loser, but there were results and outcomes. And last thing we're going to talk about, one of the big results of the war. This was not a good result for Native Americans because before the war, British had been helping them and they had been giving them guns, and the natives needed those guns to fight American settlers who were pushing onto their lands. Once the war is over, the British no longer give them guns, and Native Americans are kind of weakened. And over the next 20 years, natives were pushed west of the Mississippi River. The second result was our national pride grew, nationalism. Americans were proud. If you had asked Americans back then, they would tell you they won the war. That wasn't officially correct, but they were proud that they stood up to the British and fought them well. Madison, at the beginning of the war, called this the Second War of Independence. Number three, politics. The Federalist Party was severely weakened by this war. In fact, they disappeared shortly thereafter. They lost power and they began to fade away. And you may think, well, that's not a big deal. It is a big deal because, as we learned in the last unit, the Federalists, that was Washington and Adams and Hamilton. That would be our modern day equivalent if the Democratic Party faded away or the Republican Party faded away. Fourth one, Great Britain is out of the United States forever. They were never a threat again after this war. And what was really weird, I think, is typically after a war, the two countries that were fighting each other, they still don't like each other. They're still enemies. But really, after this war, the United States and Britain became friends again relatively quickly, and we didn't have to worry about them like attacking us or us attacking them.